In the zombie genre, few threats are as devastating as the Solanum virus. Not because it is simply another lethal pathogen, but because it represents an absolute rupture with everything we understand about life, disease, and death. Solanum does not just kill the beings it infects, it rewrites the human body, shuts down its identity, and turns it into a vehicle of propagation whose only function is to keep spreading the infection. That is why, more than the zombies themselves, the true antagonist of this story is the virus itself. The infected are nothing more than the visible manifestation of a biological force that seems designed to erase our species. What is most interesting is that Solanum does not belong entirely either to the world of the film or to that of the novels, because both versions share the same general concept, but present important differences in their behavior. In Max Brooks's books, the infection follows a slower and more detailed progression, with a process that can take almost a full day before culminating in reanimation. In the 2013 film, by contrast, the virus behaves like a hyper-fast plague that transforms a person in seconds. They are two different interpretations of the same infection, but both preserve the central essence of the pathogen: a total mortality rate, the absence of a definitive cure, and an outcome that is almost always irreversible. The origin of Solanum remains one of the greatest mysteries in the entire franchise. Despite investigations and attempts to trace its point of origin, a pure sample of the virus has never been found in nature. That absence has given rise to multiple theories. Some suggest that it is an ancestral agent, present on Earth since prehistoric times and reactivated at different moments in human history. Others suggest that it may have emerged in some unknown ecosystem, perhaps in the depths of the ocean or in regions that science has never fully explored. There is also the possibility that it is the result of biological experiments, an idea that fits with certain documents from the expanded universe that link China to secret research conducted after the Second World War. And of course, there is the supernatural interpretation, the most symbolic of all, according to which Solanum would be a kind of punishment against a humanity that has pushed the world to its limit. The only thing that is relatively clear is that the most devastating outbreak, the one that ends up becoming World War Z, seems to have originated in China. In the novels, it is suggested that Patient Zero was a child bitten while he was in a flooded area of the Yangtze River, near an ancient submerged city. From that moment on, the infection would have begun to spread silently, taking advantage of clandestine routes, human trafficking, black markets for organs, refugee movements, and a slowness of governments to recognize what was happening. That detail is crucial because Solanum did not destroy the world solely because of its lethality. It also did so because it appeared in the worst possible environment, with a globalized civilization saturated with connections, logistical dependence, and political denial. In other words, the virus did not need to be invincible to almost wipe out humanity. It only needed to enter the right system. Once inside the organism, the Solanum virus begins a process of propagation that almost always ends in the death of the host. The best-known route of transmission is the bite, but it is not the only one. Contact with infected blood or saliva through open wounds can also be enough to trigger the process. What matters is not just touching the virus, but giving it direct access to the bloodstream. That explains why, in this universe, not all casual contact produces an immediate transformation. The infection needs to penetrate the body effectively in order to reach its true target, the brain. As far as we know, this virus does not seem to spread through the air or water the way influenza or an environmental bacterium would. Its expansion depends on effective contact with infected fluids and a real road of entry into the body. From there begins the most disturbing part of how it works. Solanum is not limited to causing fever, inflammation, or necrosis as a conventional pathogen would. Its main target is the frontal lobe, one of the brain regions most closely linked to judgment, personality, impulse control, and rational behavior. In essence, the virus attacks precisely the part of the brain that makes us conscious individuals. As it replicates, it destroys those functions and reduces the host to a primitive state. No memories, empathy, reasoning, or real instinct for self-preservation remain. Only one basic directive remains: to keep spreading in healthy bodies. Here appears one of the great differences between the book version and the film version. In the novels, the transformation follows a much slower and more methodical sequence. First, pain appears in the area of the bite, then intense fever, chills, vomiting, confusion, loss of coordination, numbness, paralysis, coma, and finally, clinical death. After that process, the body reanimates. All of this lasts about 23 hours. In the film, by contrast, that progression is condensed into seconds. The bitten person goes into convulsions almost instantly, collapses, and returns as a highly aggressive creature. It is less realistic from a medical point of view, but also more brutal in narrative terms, because it almost completely eliminates any margin for reaction. The strangest thing about Solanum is that once the transformation is complete, many of the body's normal functions cease to be necessary. The heart stops, the lungs stop performing their function. However, the body keeps moving. That is the idea that makes these infected so unsettling. They are not living beings in a conventional sense, but neither are they inert corpses. They are organisms reconfigured to continue functioning under a different logic. In the novels, it is proposed that the virus profoundly alters the host cells, partially freeing them from the physiological systems that previously sustained them. It is an extreme explanation, but within the universe it serves to justify why a zombie can keep moving despite injuries that would kill any person. And there appears another key trait that makes Solanum so particular. The virus can affect other forms of animal life and is considered lethal to almost any organism that comes into contact with it. But complete reanimation occurs only in humans. That difference suggests that Solanum is not simply trying to create mobile corpses at random, but that it fits specifically with our biology. It can kill other animals, yes, but it does not turn them into functional vectors of the outbreak. Only the human body offers the exact conditions for the infection to continue, even after clinical death. That also explains their resistance to pain. A normal human body stops because pain protects it, limits it, and forces it to conserve energy or avoid further damage. A body infected by Solanum loses that break. It can run with fractures, slam itself against surfaces, tear its muscles, or fall from considerable heights and still keep moving because it no longer interprets damage as an alarm signal. Its organism is not trying to preserve itself in the traditional sense. It is trying to keep spreading the virus for as long as possible. If there is one thing that makes the infected in World War Z so striking within the genre, it is not just the fact that they are dead and still moving, because that is already common in almost any zombie story, but the way they do it. In the film, the virus turns its victims into explosive, fast, erratic predators that are almost impossible to stop when they move in large groups. Their only priority is to find healthy bodies, open a route of entry for the virus, and move on to the next target without stopping. They are not trying to feed, and they do not hunt out of hunger. Their function is to infect. That completely changes the nature of the threat they represent. Here, an infected individual does not need to tear an entire person apart to fulfill its function. A bite, a deep scratch, or contact between infected fluids and an open wound is enough. After that, the work is already done. The new host will begin to collapse, and within seconds or hours, depending on the version of the story, will join the chain of transmission. That is why every encounter with one of them is much more dangerous than it seems. Even a minor wound can amount to a death sentence. There is also something unsettling in the way the infected perceive their surroundings. They are drawn to intense noises, especially if those sounds seem to originate from human activity. Alarms, gunshots, engines, screams, loudspeakers. All of that works like a beacon for the horde. In a way, the virus seems to take advantage of the signals of civilization to find new hosts. And there lies a brutal irony. Modern cities, full of traffic, sirens, densely populated buildings, and automated systems, go from being spaces of order and progress to becoming perfect traps for the infection. In the novels, by contrast, the zombies are much slower, but also more persistent. They do not throw themselves into frantic stampedes or form mountains of bodies to overcome walls. They advance with the stubbornness of something that does not get tired, does not feel fear, and does not need to sleep. That version may be less visually spectacular, but it has another kind of horror. A slow enemy can still become invincible if it never stops. Because there, the real problem is not speed, but persistence in numbers. A human being can run away from something fast once. What they cannot do is run forever from something that never gives up. That becomes very clear in episodes like the Battle of Yonkers. There, a military machine designed to crush conventional enemies is forced to face a threat that does not respond to pain, fear, or the psychological impact of war. The zombies do not retreat, do not lose morale, and do not break formation. They keep advancing, and when an enemy does not tire, does not hesitate, and does not need to survive in order to remain dangerous, even the most impressive firepower can become insufficient. But there is another detail that makes Solanum even more particular. Animals seem to detect the virus in an almost instinctive way. In the expanded lore, it is suggested that many species react with fear or rejection to the presence of the infected, as if they perceive something deeply anomalous in them even before making direct contact. It is as if the virus leaves behind a biological signature that the rest of the animal kingdom can recognize immediately. Dogs stand out in particular because, unlike other animals, they can remain close enough to humans to become a useful tool. That sensitivity makes them valuable for tracking infected zones or detecting people incubating the virus before they transform. It is a small but important detail because it suggests that Solanum not only alters the human body, it also leaves behind a signal so strange that even other species seem to recognize and reject it instinctively. This also connects with another of the most disturbing aspects of the virus, its relationship with decomposition. In most stories about the living dead, time works against the zombies. The body rots, the tissues collapse, and nature eventually reclaims what remains. With Solanum, however, something different happens. The virus seems to greatly slow that deterioration. Bacteria and other microorganisms that would normally consume the corpse do not thrive as easily, and infected tissue becomes toxic to other forms of life. That allows the bodies to remain functional for much longer than they should. In cold climates, they can even freeze, remain motionless for months, and reactivate when temperatures rise again. That toxicity is one of Solanum's strangest traits, and also one of the most important for understanding why these infected last so long. Contaminated flesh ceases to be simple dead tissue and becomes a hostile environment, an altered organic matter that can no longer be recycled by nature in the usual way. That means that even if another animal comes into contact with that tissue or consumes it, the result is not a new reanimation, but an almost certain death. In this way, the virus breaks one of the most basic processes of the natural world, decomposition and the biological use of a corpse. That detail turns each infected into a persistent threat. In many other works of fiction, zombies become less dangerous as the months go by because their bodies deteriorate or are destroyed by insects, fungi, and scavengers. Here the opposite happens. Infected flesh seems to resist that cycle, not because it is indestructible, but because the virus turns the body into a chemically hostile environment for almost any form of life that would normally accelerate its disintegration. In that way, each zombie ceases to be just a transformed victim. It becomes a walking reserve of the outbreak, a persistent source of contagion that can remain dangerous when everything else already seems to be over. And even so, within that brutal scenario, there is a minimal possibility of survival for those who are bitten. In the books and in the general logic of this universe, the immediate amputation of an infected limb can save a person, although only in very rare cases. The reason is simple and ruthless. Solanum travels too fast. If the bite occurs in a peripheral area, and the amputation is performed almost immediately, there is still a small chance of preventing the virus from reaching the brain. But the margin is minimal and the success rate extremely low. It is not a reliable solution, much less a cure. It is only a desperate measure that, in exceptional circumstances, can delay an almost certain sentence. But for all the devastations Solanum seems capable of causing, it also has a very strange weakness in its behavior, one that exists only in the film and ends up changing the course of the war. The infected do not attack all people equally. In the middle of the initial chaos, Jerry begins to notice something that at first seems like simple coincidence. Certain individuals are completely ignored by the horde. These are not hidden people or especially quiet survivors, but terminally ill individuals or severely deteriorated bodies that, for some reason, stop being attractive to the virus. That observation is one of the most interesting ideas presented in the film because it suggests that Solanum does not behave like a blind pathogen, but like something selective. At first glance, this might seem like a simple narrative excuse, but there is a real concept in virology that helps explain it. When a cell is already infected by a virus, it can become resistant to a second infection, a phenomenon known as viral interference. It is, in a way, a form of biological territorialism. In the context of World War Z, Solanum could interpret a pre-existing terminal illness as a kind of competition or simply as a degraded biological environment in which it is not worth investing resources. In addition, we know that a sick human body really does change its chemistry. The smell of the skin, sweat, breath, and the composition of the blood are altered. Inflammation, fever, and tissue damage modify the compounds we constantly emit. If the infected are capable of detecting those signals in the same way that some animals perceive illness in other individuals, then this invisibility stops seeming like an arbitrary device and begins to function as a plausible adaptation of the virus. That makes the zombies even more terrifying, because it indicates that they are not uncontrolled predators, but extensions of an infectious mechanism that seems to operate with a logic of its own. That is why in the film we see very specific examples of people who are passed over: a clearly sick homeless man, a child with a visible condition, and a soldier with a severe leg injury. They all share the same characteristic. The virus perceives them as defective material. From there comes the film's famous improvised solution, using treatable diseases as a form of biological camouflage. It is not a cure, nor does it really immunize the human being against Solanum. All it does is deceive the infected, making them believe the host is not worth it. That marks a crucial difference because the world does not discover how to defeat the virus, but how to hide from it temporarily. And that solution, ingenious as it may be, also makes something much darker clear. Even when humanity finds an advantage, it is still playing under the virus's rules. Because even with that weakness, it would be a mistake to think Solanum ceases to be a global threat. In fact, what causes the most damage is not only what it does inside the body, but the kind of world in which it appears. World War Z makes it quite clear that an infection like this does not collapse civilization solely because of its mortality rate, but because it strikes humanity at its most fragile points. Political denial, overcrowded cities, dependence on logistical chains, and the speed at which people travel across a hyper-connected planet. That detail is even more evident in the novels. There, the war against the zombies is not presented as a simple succession of attacks and escapes, but as a conflict on a planetary scale with military, social, economic, and environmental consequences. What matters is not only that there are millions of infected, but the way nations react late, badly, or contradictorily. Some governments try to hide the truth, others downplay the problem, others turn chaos into political opportunity. Meanwhile, borders collapse, supply routes break down, and the population panics long before it truly understands what it is facing. Solanum takes advantage of all of that. Every official lie, every poorly organized evacuation, every improvised checkpoint, and every overcrowded city works in its favor. There is also another key element: fear. Not just the fear of dying, but the fear of deciding. In a scenario where a bite amounts to an almost certain death sentence, morality becomes a burden. How long does it take for a family to accept that one of its members is already lost? How long does it take for a doctor to stop trying to save a patient and start protecting the rest? How long does it take for a society to assume that misplaced compassion can become a direct route for the spread of the outbreak? That is one of the harshest aspects of World War Z. The virus does not just destroy bodies, it forces humans to make brutal decisions. And the longer they take to make them, the more ground the infection gains. Maybe that is why Solanum remains so fascinating within the zombie genre. Because it is not simply an excuse to create fast monsters, or scenes of mass destruction. It is a tool to show how quickly the world can collapse when a biological threat exploits our biology, our arrogance, and our mistakes all at once. In that scenario, the zombies are only the visible part of the problem. The real catastrophe was always the human reaction to something that arrived too soon, was understood too late, and demanded a hardness for which almost no one was prepared. In the end, that is what makes the Solanum virus one of the most interesting zombie pathogens in the genre. It is not just an infection that kills quickly, or a plague that produces violent creatures. It is a threat that forces us to rethink almost everything we take for granted about the human body, society, and the very idea of survival. In many zombie stories, the infected function as a simple metaphor for chaos. Here, by contrast, the virus has rules, patterns, limits, and a logic of its own, and that is precisely why it feels more believable, more terrifying, and much more memorable. That is also why the book version still carries so much weight. The film managed to create very effective scenes and a spectacular version of the infected, but it simplified much of the depth that the original concept had. In the novels, World War Z does not feel like the story of a single hero who finds a solution at the end. It feels like a complete historical event, like a long, painful, and uneven war in which humanity does not win thanks to one brilliant moment, but through adaptation, discipline, sacrifice, and a brutal understanding of its own limitations. There, Solanum is not just the origin of the disaster, it is the engine of a global transformation that forces entire countries, armies, and communities to reinvent themselves if they want to keep existing. And perhaps that is the strongest part of the entire concept. Solanum does not turn humanity into the victim of an external monster, but into the victim of its own fragility. It exposes the arrogance of governments, the slowness of institutions, and the dependence of a civilization that seemed invincible until a virus appeared that was capable of using all of that against it. That is why, even among so many fictional viruses in film, comics, and video games, Solanum continues to hold a special place, because it does not just create monsters, it creates a world in which humanity discovers, far too late, that the worst plague is not always the one that kills the most, but the one that best knows how to use everything we are against us. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, remember to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell to stay up to date with all my new videos. I also want to give a special shout out to the channel members. Thanks to you and all of our viewers, we can keep diving into these kinds of disturbing and thought-provoking stories. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. And if you want to support the channel and get access to exclusive content, early videos, and other perks, I invite you to become a member. Just click the join button below this video. See you in the next one.